Vichara Supply Chain, highlighting and showcasing solutions for the most complex challenges facing the industry in 21st century by our team of subject matter experts and mentors, broadcasting every week all year round. We will present the most up-to-date series of podcasts and webinars.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Vichara Supply Chain. This is Nur Hadi, your host, and we have a very special guest today, Peter Schram, an expert in supply chain planning transformation, and he is based in the Netherlands. Thank you for joining us, Peter. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Nur Hadi.
Okay, so in today's episode, we are going to talk about rethinking digital planning roadmaps. But before that, Peter, can you please brief a bit by yourself and your professional background?
Sure, thank you. So I've built a career so far of almost 18 years in supply chain, and the first 15 years of my career I spent half the time in consulting and half the time in industry. So as a consultant, I worked for Accenture and IG&H Consulting. And in that role, I worked for customers like APM Terminals, Shell, and the Dutch importer Volkswagen. And in the industry, I worked for Paccar in track manufacturing and for Philips Lighting, which is now called Signify. And in Signify, I was the global program manager for S&OP for the professional lighting business. Then roughly 3 years ago, I was approached by Gartner. And I started working there as a senior director analyst. And for me, it was really quite an honor to work in that environment, you know, with really smart people and you know, a great brand. So I combined their advisory and research, and my research focused on planning. So basically focused on S&OP and S&OE, demand and supply and inventory planning, but also on the transformation side. And that's also where, of course, we will touch upon a bit during this podcast. So really also helping organizations to kind of get the benefit out of planning. And although I really liked the job, you know, I was kind of feeling that it was not really fulfilling my purpose, in a sense that I was feeling that I was not making enough impact. So I did a lot of interactions with different customers. So I think maybe up to 500-600 interactions.
Yeah.
But you know, the number of interactions you have with one customer is rather limited. So I was not feeling that I was making impact enough with customers. And because I had so much interactions, I also didn't feel that I was not innovative enough in my research and that I was not really addressing the problems of our time, but also getting the right insights to really help customers. So that's kind of why, although I really liked working at Gartner, that's why I decided to leave. And I started my own company, which I call Breakthrough Advisory, with the aim to help customers unlock the potential of planning. And basically I do three things. So I act as a virtual center of excellence for planning. So providing customers with best-in-class knowledge and external insights. I act as a sparring partner, secondly. So it's kind of being a professional outsider and helping organizations with a fresh view on their kind of planning journey and planning transformation. And lastly, I still do my research. So I focus on sustainability in planning. I look at company culture and leadership and the impact on planning decision making. And last but not least, I'm now involved in a project called Zebra, which is headed by Laura Cesare from Supply Chain Insights and also supported by O9 Solutions, where they have gathered 15 supply chain leaders, academics, and thought leaders to rethink planning and to make it future-proof.
Mm. Interesting. All right. So talking about the digital planning roadmaps, Peter, what are your observations on the current journey of the supply chain planning digital transformation? What is the current state of digital planning?
Yeah, it's actually a very good question. And you can wonder whether, you know, the glass is half full or if the glass is half empty. So if I would be looking back at the case for change, right? So there's an enormous case for change for digital transformation, right? So if I look at the big challenges of our world, you know, if I look at, for example, the sustainability challenges that we have, you know, looking at resource scarcity, public health and safety and labor rights. And also if I look at, for example, globalization, so changing power balances and, you know, the global competition, that's more and more fierce. And of course, with all the new technologies, there's a real need that we need to change and that the supply chain needs to support that, right? So we need to react. But somewhere the conclusion is that we, as kind of a supply chain community, we are not good enough at it, right? So if I look at some research also from Supply Chain Insights, it indicates that only 1/3 of supply chain leaders is actually happy with their supply chain performance, and that actually the improvement of supply chain performance is stalling, right? So if you look, for example, at the average inventory turns, they have decreased over the last 10 years, right? So we have not increased inventory turns, but actually the inventory terms have decreased. So there's a really need to change. And of course, technology can help really in that. So there's an enormous amount of opportunities, especially in planning, that can help build and improve our supply chain and the supply chain performance. And I talk quite a bit to all the big technology vendors, and I'm also a startup mentor at Plug and Play, which is one of the biggest technology incubators in the world. Then kind of you see that there's almost unlimited possibilities with digital technology. So ranging from artificial intelligence or machine learning or connectivity, right? So can you connect planning to devices which are out there in the field, or also devices which can also connect to your suppliers. I mean, cloud, robotic process automation, digital twin. So there's a lot of things that are possible. But I think the biggest issue, if you talk about transformation, is that there's a really big gap with where the majority of organizations are, right? So there's a sense that everybody is doing something, but the question is something really happening? And if I then look at supply chain planning maturity, then you also see that somewhere only 30 to 40% of organizations are actually happy with their planning performance. So also the most organizations I talk to, they are probably a level 2 on a 5-point scale. So there's a very big opportunity, but if I look at the majority of organizations that I talk to, it's still very short-term focus. It's very supply chain driven. It's siloed. It's a tedious process. It's focused at efficiency and cost control, and there are still a lot of uses of Excel, right? So we might have planning tools and all kind of digital technology, but a lot of planners are still getting the data out of their systems and putting it into Excel to do their own manipulations, right? So there is a very big gap between the promise and the reality, and I have the feeling sometimes that that's even actually widening, right? So technology is still developing, but we are not so much developing our planning maturity. And the second thing kind of that you see is that there's also becoming a bigger difference between the leaders who are progressing and the organizations who are doing nothing, right? So who are really stalling in their performance. And I think the key point here is, Nuradi, is that the key issue is not so much the capability of the technology itself, but it's much more a issue of kind of change management and leadership to enable the usage of these digital technologies. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So in the context of a COVID-19 pandemic, where organizations have to adopt a new norm, how is that impacting digital planning transformations, Peter?
Yeah, very good question again. So I think that, if you would have asked me this question in June, I probably would have answered differently than I would be answering right now, right? Because I think, after the first wave of COVID, there was a great deal of optimism around, how supply chain would be transformed based on COVID. Everybody was kind of highly ambitious about what needed to be done. We needed to have better insight in customer behavior, because we all realized that historical data was not a good forecasting mechanism, or not good data for knowing what's going on in the world. So we need more sensing and better understanding about what's happening in the world and using different information from that. Everybody was agreeing that visibility is needed to kind of sense what's also going on upstream in the supply chain. We all agreed that we needed more simulation and scenario planning. And we all wanted to have more automation to bring efficiency, to create speed, and to also reduce bias, right? So I think there was a very big sense of optimism that could be realized through kind of what we have seen happening in the first wave of COVID. So kind of what's happening right now is that COVID is actually taking very long, right? And the impact of COVID is very different on companies, right? So if I look at my own environment here in the Netherlands, I see some companies are doing really well. So if I look at high tech, we have a company called ASML over here who is growing with 50%, I think more or less from 2019 to 2020. I see that IKEA can't handle the orders anymore. So there's some outlook on the positive side, but there's also some impact on the negative side, right? So I read today in the newspaper that shoe sales have gone down with 20%. Signify, the company that I worked for, is letting go of 700 people the last week. So my point is that the longer that COVID is taking, the more uncertainty is being brought into organizations, and that means that there's becoming much more pressure on cost management and working capital, right? So organizations are doing a lot more things to manage cost and to manage working capital, which means that they're also taking back on risks, right? So they're not investing as soon anymore in new technologies. And also the question to the technology vendors being asked to show their value immediately, right? And that's a very different feeling than the feeling that we were having in June, because they're much more stricter on kind of new investments. And the second thing that I see happening is that also because of the layoffs, organizations are downsizing. So first in the external people that they were hiring, but now also internally, which kind of leaves the group of people who need to do the things with more work that needs to be done, right? So it's like you have a funnel, you make the funnel smaller, but you keep on throwing more marbles in that funnel, right? And there is a very big risk that if you do that in the end, nothing will come out anymore. So to answer your question, Anuradi, so in June, I think there was much more optimism of what could be achieved in planning transformation. And I think that right now we need to basically reevaluate what can be done based on the effect that we see in organizations in terms of the budget and the people that they're having.
Interesting. And what advice can you provide to the CEO and top leaders position in driving the transformation? In other words, my question is, what are the top priorities and what is the role of leadership in the journey, Peter?
Yeah, so I think it's not a choice if you want to go on the digital transformation, but it's much more a question on how, right? So I think there's no doubt, despite all the things that I've talked about, there's no doubt that you have to act as an organization. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think this is all about leadership, right? So leadership should be enabling and showing the way on the planning transformation and all digital transformation in a broader sense. So there's a lot of advice that I can give, but let me kind of focus on the 4 key things that I think that organizations and supply chain leaders and also maybe CEOs should be doing. Yeah. And I think the first thing is that you need to realize that digital is not a goal in itself, right? But you need to define what digital needs to be doing to support your business, right? So digital optimization is something very different from digital transformation. And what I mean with digital optimization is that you just become much more cost efficient, or maybe you can provide a different experience to your customers. And digital transformation is doing something very different, and maybe even creating a different business model with digital technology, right? So, I was working at Signify, so you can now think about a light as a service instead of selling luminaires, right? So the question in planning is, so what is the business strategy and how will the supply chain help with that? So what's the supply chain operating model and how can supply chain planning support that? So I think that's the first thing that you need to keep in mind and that you need to define before you can go into a digital planning transformation. Then the second thing is that you need to think about, it's not about digitizing individual activities in planning, but that you really have to look at, so how can we improve planning in a broader sense and much more integrally? And that, of course, is also difficult, and that also means that you need to move to a higher planning maturity. And that, of course, requires a high level of alignment and collaboration with the other functions in your organization, right? So it is not so much that the supply chain function is going to work on digital transformation and digital planning transformation, but you have to look at it much more from an integral perspective, collaborating with all the different functions in your organization. Mm-hmm. Then the third thing is, it's really about setting the priorities, right? And there's really a big temptation, I think, right now to dive into all the operational issues that are still existing and that are still here of a lot in this COVID period. But you should not forget about the longer term, right? So there's this very important and well-known Eisenhower matrix, which kind of distinguishes between urgent and important problems and which you need to focus on. And of course, you need to focus on the urgent and important things, but you also should make time for the maybe not so urgent, but very important things that you need to plan out for, right? So you need to balance your roadmap between fixing short-term things, but also preparing for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then fourthly, last but not least, it's very important to build the knowledge and to build the capability internally, right? So I just already mentioned that there is a really scarcity of people because, a lot of people have also been let go of. So it is also very important to realize that you need to build that capability internally and that you are in the driving seat yourself. And of course, you can use external support for that. But digital transformation, digital planning transformation is such an important topic that you also have to drive that yourself and to drive that also internally.
Yeah, awesome. Interesting. All right, I actually still have a couple of questions, Peter, but we are running out of time. So before we close today's conversation, what are some other key takeaways that you like to share with our listener?
Yeah, so I think kind of for me, the key takeaways, digital is the future, right? So digital is the future, and we are going through a very difficult period in time right now, in the sense that, there's a lot of pressure on the supply chain organization. But I think for me, the key thing is that you need to make sure that of course you come to this period, right? So I do understand that there's a lot of pressure on the financial figures and kind of the risks that we see right now due to the current situation. But if you do not start building kind of your future, and if you do not have a solid roadmap, which also helps you to develop beyond kind of the current operational horizon, you will become a laggard. And I don't think that that's where you want to be. So you need to be proactive in thinking about where you want to be in 4 or 5 years from now.
At Paccar Supply Chain, we are committed to driving global perspective to embrace technological adaptation in improving process efficiencies. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share Paccar Supply Chain. And stay tuned for the latest updates. To learn more, visit our website www.paccarasupplychain.com. Thank you for listening to us. We look forward to seeing you at our next episode.